When we think about World War I, or the Great War, it's easy to picture it as something that happened over there, a European thing. But here's the deal. This conflict absolutely rocked the United States, pulling it onto the world stage and changing the country in ways that we still feel today. So, the big question is, how did a nation so determined to stay neutral get dragged into the biggest, bloodiest war the world had ever seen? Well, let's get into it.
So, picture this. It's 1916. President Woodrow Wilson is up for re-election, and his campaign comes up with this absolute killer of a slogan: "He kept us out of war." And it worked. It perfectly captured how most Americans felt. For the first 2 years of this brutal conflict, the U.S. was all about neutrality. It was Europe's mess, and we wanted no part of it.
And yet, just a few months after riding that slogan all the way to his second term, that same President Wilson goes before Congress and asks them to declare war. I mean, talk about a plot twist. How in the world do you go from staying out to all in so fast? To really get that, we've got to rewind a bit and look at the world that created this war in the first place.
Yeah, before a single shot was fired, Europe was tense, incredibly tense. The best way to think about it is like a giant barrel of gunpowder, a powder keg, just sitting there, packed with old grudges and new ambitions, waiting, just waiting for one tiny spark to blow the whole thing sky high.
Okay, now if you ever took a history class, you might remember this one. Historians love a good acronym, and for World War I, it's MAIN. It's the perfect way to remember the long-term causes. You've got M for militarism, this crazy arms race where everyone's building bigger armies and deadlier weapons. A for alliances, this tangled mess of secret treaties where countries basically said, "I got your back," creating these two huge teams before the game even started. I for imperialism, the scramble for colonies and power all over the world. And finally, N for nationalism, a force so powerful it really needs its own slide.
And this last one, nationalism, was a huge, huge deal. I mean, just imagine for a second. You belong to a group of people with your own language, your own culture, your own history, but you're being ruled by some giant foreign empire. You had groups all over Europe, the Bosnians, the Poles, the Irish, who were bursting with pride and were desperate to have their own country. They didn't want to be a tiny part of someone else's empire. They wanted to be their own nation.
So you've got the guns, the secret pacts, the rivalries, and these burning nationalist feelings. The whole continent is a tinderbox. All it took was one single, shocking moment to set the whole thing on fire.
And this was it. This was the spark. On June 28, 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, a guy named Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. So a month later, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. And then, remember those alliances? They kick in like a row of dominoes. Russia says, "We'll back Serbia." Germany says, "We'll back Austria-Hungary." Then France gets pulled in. Then Great Britain. It was just this unstoppable chain reaction that plunged an entire continent into war.
Within just a few weeks, millions of soldiers were marching off to what they thought would be a quick, glorious war. But what they found was something else. Something new. Something absolutely horrific. So the teams were basically set. You had the Central Powers on one side, that's mainly Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And on the other side, you had the Allied powers, France, the British Empire, and the gigantic Russian Empire.
But instead of a war of movement and grand battles, things just stopped. The armies dug in, creating hundreds and hundreds of miles of muddy, disgusting trenches, and in between them, this terrifying, barren wasteland called No Man's Land. With new weapons like the machine gun, trying to cross it was basically a death sentence. This led to a miserable, bloody stalemate that lasted for 4 long years, with millions dying over a few feet of ground.
In the cost, I mean, just look at that number. An estimated 35 million people dead. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around. But here's a really important part of that number. Historians think almost half of those people were civilians. They died from starvation, disease, and just the utter chaos of this new kind of total war. Now, all this time, America is watching this horror show from across the Atlantic. But slowly, event by event, the United States starts getting pulled closer and closer to the edge of the conflict. So what finally did it? What pushed the U.S. in? Well, it wasn't just one thing, it was like a pileup. First, you have a German submarine sinking the passenger ship Lusitania, killing over 100 Americans. Public outrage was huge. Then Germany just doubles down and says they're going to sink any ship heading to Britain. The real kicker, though, was probably the Zimmermann Note,
This secret telegram that gets intercepted where Germany is literally trying to get Mexico to attack the United States. And on top of all that, a revolution in Russia gets rid of the Tsar, which made it a lot easier for America to sell this as a war of democracies against oppressive empires.
And so, by April of 1917, everything had changed. The same man who won an election by promising to stay out of the war now stood in front of Congress and gave this incredible speech arguing that America had to fight to make the world safe for democracy.
Of course, getting the public on board was a whole other challenge. The government launched this massive propaganda blitz. They set up the Committee on Public Information, which churned out posters, movies, and speeches encouraging everyone to buy war bonds, plant victory gardens, and, to really stir up anti-German feelings. It was a total effort to get the entire country behind the war.
And the American soldiers who finally went to Europe, they got this fantastic nickname, Doughboys. When these fresh, energetic troops, the American Expeditionary Forces, started arriving in France, it was like a massive shot of adrenaline for the totally exhausted Allies. Their numbers and their energy were exactly what was needed to finally break that brutal stalemate and turn the tide of the war.
With America in the fight, the momentum shifted for good. By the end of 1918, the Central Powers were falling apart, and you could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. But it turns out, winning the war was one thing. Winning the peace was going to be a whole lot harder.
The fighting officially came to a stop at a moment that's so easy to remember, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. After 4 long years, the guns finally went silent. The Great War was over.
But now came the hard part, and this slide really shows you the two completely opposite ideas for what should happen next. On one side, you have President Wilson. He shows up with his idealistic 14 points, pushing for a peace without victory. But the European allies, they had been devastated by the war, and they wanted one thing, revenge. So they pushed through the Treaty of Versailles, which basically blamed Germany for everything, stripped them of their military, and slapped them with massive payments that would absolutely crush their economy for decades.
And here's the final incredible irony of the whole story. The centerpiece of Wilson's plan was creating a League of Nations to make sure a war like this could never happen again. The League was actually created, but the U.S. Senate, worried it would just drag America into more European problems, refused to ratify the treaty. The United States never even joined its own president's big idea, and instead just went right back into isolation.
They called it the war to end all wars. But when you look at the Treaty of Versailles, how it left Germany totally humiliated and broken, you can't help but see it planting the seeds of anger and resentment that just 20 years later would explode into an even bigger, even deadlier world war. So it leaves you with this really haunting question. Was this whole thing doomed from the start? Right there at the peace table,